The disciples had spent 3 years with Jesus. They watched miracle after miracle. They were Jewish, so they would have known about the fulfilled prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. They listened to him preach and teach without contradiction, as one with authority. They witnessed his mastery over nature and even over death itself. They saw him die a cruel death on a cross after being flogged, beaten, mocked, humiliated, and they saw him resurrected just like he said he would be on the third day. And so surely if there is anybody ever whose faith would have been rock solid, wouldn't it be the disciples, right? Well, not so much. They had their doubts. They were not 100% convinced. In Matthew chapter 8, or chapter 28 rather, we love Matthew 28. Verse 18 of Matthew 28, that's like our mission as a church. The resurrected Jesus is with them, and he's about to ascend into heaven, and he gives them their mission. When Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to you, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded. We love that verse in Matthew 28:18. But sometimes we skip over verses 16 and 17. Verses 16 and 17 says this: Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And when they saw him, they worshiped him. But then it says some doubted. Some doubted. How could they doubt, right? I mean, they're looking right at him. But it was hard for them to believe, and Jesus must have known that, and yet he doesn't rebuke them, and he goes on again to entrust them with the Great Commission to spread the gospel. Last week I talked about how the resurrection is the most important event in Christianity. The Apostle Paul wrote, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance. If Christ," he said, "isn't resurrected, then our faith is futile, and we are still in our sin." But it's also the most important event, not only in the history of the church, but in the history of the entire world. But what about the times when we kind of doubt, like the disciples did right before Jesus gave them this commission? How can we know with reasonable assurance? Well, we say, it's faith. We're supposed to take it on faith. Hebrews says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. And that is true. But it seems like the early church, it seems like the gospel writers and others wanted to have some proof. But yet the church has not always done a good job with those who doubt. We have not always reflected God's heart for those who, like you and like me, I'm sure at times, just kind of weren't quite sure and had some questions. And sometimes the church has kind of not been a place where people can really seek honestly the truth. And we have sometimes given the impression that there's something to hide, that the Christian faith, that the Bible can't really stand up to scrutiny, and yet it does. But I am so glad the Bible is clear that God is patient and understanding toward those who sometimes have doubts. And you know what? We should be as well. The little book of Jude in the New Testament says it all. It says, "Be merciful to those who doubt," in verse 22. The pages of the Bible are filled with people who had doubts, people who had reservations, people who sometimes doubted their beliefs and other times believed their doubts. And yet God was always merciful to them. Just a couple examples come to mind. Already mentioned the disciples, but what about John the Baptist? John the Baptist, he was the man, Jesus' cousin, the first to recognize that Jesus was the Messiah when they were both still in their mother's wombs. Prophesied the way for Jesus to come. John baptized him. When John baptized him, he brought him up out of the water, and it says the heavens opened and the doves descended, and the voice of God said, "This is my beloved Son." If anybody should be 100% sure that Jesus was the Son of God, it should be John the Baptist. And that was until John faced a crisis in his life. And he was facing death, and then he began to doubt. He began to wonder, and maybe that's your story. Maybe you had certain faith at one point in your life until your life was hit by a crisis. I don't know what it might have been. You can fill in the blank. There's any number of them. But for whatever reason, you felt let down by God. And then all of a sudden, like, I don't know. If it's true, then why did this, whatever it is, happen to me? So here's John the Baptist, the great confident prophet. He's now in prison, and he's soon to be killed, and he knows that he's going to be killed. And there's no one to rescue him, and so he's wondering. He's doubting. So he sends a messenger to Jesus. He sends some of his guys to go to Jesus, basically asking Jesus, hey, John wants to know, just wants to be sure, are you the one to come? Are you the one? Or is there going to be somebody else after you? Were we right about you? All that stuff that I said about you, John wants to know, was it right? Or should we expect somebody else? So they go and they tell Jesus what's going on. They ask Jesus that question. And Jesus says to them, hey, go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. Just give him the evidence he needs for the confidence that he lacks, that the blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed. You see, when Jesus meets unwavering faith, he honors it. When he encounters people who are sincerely seeking the truth, doing their best to overcome their doubts, he honors it, he welcomes it, he answers it, and he overcomes it. Mark 9:24, Jesus encounters a man whose son is demon-possessed. And at one point, that man turns to Jesus and he says, Jesus, if you can do anything, then please take pity on us and help us. If you can. Like, that's not exactly confident. And Jesus replies, if you can, everything is possible for the one who believes. And I love the Father's honest response. He says, well, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. I think a lot of us kind of live in that area sometimes in our lives where we do believe, but God, would you help us to overcome our unbelief? I love that. So what would Jesus do with that man's answer that wasn't brimming with 100% confidence? Well, he heals the boy and he honors him and accepts it. It was enough belief for Jesus to act. John chapter 20, verse 24, we talked about doubting Thomas last week, right? Jesus appears to the believers in the upper room and they believed except for the one who wasn't there, Thomas. He wasn't there. And when they told him, he said, I'm not going to believe it until I see it. I need to see his hands. I need to touch his sides. I need to see him firsthand. And so, as we saw last week, how does Jesus handle such a doubting, skeptical person, such uncertainty? Does he abandon? Does he reject or despise? Not Jesus. He loves him. He shows him. He gives him the proof that he needs. He says, Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. So I just want to be clear that the resurrection, though it's accepted by faith, is one of the most thoroughly investigated events in antiquity. And any way you cut it, it stands up to rigorous scrutiny. And so if you sometimes these days have doubts, I want you to consider some of the things that we're going to talk about here in the next few minutes. The Gospel of Luke, the biography written by Luke of Jesus, and the book of Acts were both written by a guy named Luke. Now, Luke was a doctor, and even though Luke wasn't an original follower of Jesus, he was a very, very close companion of Paul. And Luke must have been skeptical or a little doubtful at first, because when we read some of the things that he writes in the book of Luke and in the book of Acts, we kind of see this. And so in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, Luke says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself, he writes, have investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. So Luke basically said, hey, listen, Theophilus, like I interviewed people. I checked their statements. I read their testimonies. I had many conversations with Paul. I visited these places. Jesus came with proofs. Now, why would he say those things if at one point Luke didn't need to be convinced himself? And he says, like, I want to talk to these people. He's just begging people to go verify the things that he has already looked into. And listen to how he begins the book of Acts. The book of Acts is the story of the first church, the story of the early church. And look how Luke starts Acts in chapter 1 and verse 1. In my former book, Theophilus, now he's talking about his Gospel of Luke. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up into heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles that he had chosen. Verse 3 says, after his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days, and he spoke and taught about the kingdom of God. Now listen, what we need to understand is back then, when Luke was writing these things, when the Apostle Paul was writing 1 Corinthians 15, which we'll get to in a moment, it was possible for people to know with a degree of certainty and intellectual certainty that we really can't have today, because they could have checked out these things firsthand for themselves. They could investigate it. They could talk to people. They could see some of these convincing proofs for themselves. And no doubt that the miracles of the early church were amazing and were convincing many people. But it's different for us today, isn't it? It's different for us today because we don't have firsthand eyewitness verification of these things. And so some of us have made the mistake sometimes of thinking that to have faith means that you have to be certain. You have to have intellectual 100% certainty before you will believe. Certainty is defined by our modern scientific methodology. But listen, for us to have faith, it doesn't mean that we always have to have an absolute, unwavering intellectual certainty all the time. Now listen, the Greek word for faith or belief, the Greek word pistis, really doesn't carry that connotation of 100% intellectual certainty. What it really speaks of is the trust and the faith that we have in someone. It's much more about a relationship. And for us, it's about having faith in our relationship with Jesus Christ. We don't have to be 100% convinced of everything, although that's kind of what I'm going to try to do a little bit of this morning. But we just have to have faith in Jesus. We have to have faith that the record of Scripture has been handed down to us reliably as the Word of God, which it says that it has. And so we look at its record and we say, I believe this. Based on the evidence, based on the proof, based on the thing as best as I can understand it, I believe. But I think sometimes we have to say with the father of that demon-possessed boy, I believe, God, but help me with my unbelief. Now, this isn't inconsistency. It's not sort of double speak or a lack of faith. Faith, again, does not mean having absolute certainty. It means trusting and choosing to believe based on many things, based on the evidence, based on the consistency and the reliability of the Bible, based on the witnesses of the early church and those who were there, the written verification of the first century sources, even outside of the Bible. And then we consider 2,000 years of the history of the church, the presence and conviction of the Holy Spirit in our own lives. There are many, many things, and when we put them all together, all of those things taken together help us to have a reasonable amount of faith. I do believe, but sometimes I struggle. Lord, help me with my unbelief. There was a guy many years ago, one of the saints of the church, Saint Anselm. He used to capture this in a phrase like this. He used to refer to faith seeking understanding. Faith seeking understanding, that we begin with faith based on the evidence as best as we can gather it. We begin with faith, but then we embark on gaining deeper knowledge of God, and then we have greater confidence in the truth of it. Now I want to tell you what I do when I sometimes am struggling I'm just struggling to believe. Maybe I'm having some doubts and things happen in the world that make you wonder, and things happen to people in our church, and it makes me wonder, God, what's going on? And sometimes I believe God, but help me with my unbelief. I want to tell you what the best way to conquer that is, and that's to go back to the resurrection. Listen, somebody said that if a man walks out of his own grave, he is whoever he said he is, and he can do whatever he said he can do. And I believe that. And so we go back to the resurrection. If the resurrection is true, then everything else is true. God exists. Everything the Bible says is true. And that's why Paul says that the resurrection is the most important thing. And so in 1 Corinthians 15, I talked about this a little bit last week, but I want to look at this starting in verse 1. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of this gospel that I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. It's by this gospel that you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. Then he says, for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Some have fallen asleep in death. And then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared also to me as one untimely born. So he says the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the center. It is the most important thing. And he goes on to catalog these resurrection appearances. And understand this, that such a thing, a catalog or mentioning of resurrection appearances is unparalleled in all of ancient literature. From this list, Jesus appears to different people at different times, as well as people all together. 3 people, Peter, who disowned Jesus, by the way. James, who was Jesus' brother and who was very skeptical for a long time. And then there's Paul, a former enemy of the church and persecutor and killer of Christians. Jesus appeared to them. Then it says he appeared to 3 groups, to 12 minus Judas, then to more than 500 of the early followers, and then to all the apostles. And then it says that he appeared to 500 men and women at the same time. That is a truly remarkable claim. And I love how Paul says, hey, if you don't believe me, like there were hundreds of people that saw it. Why don't you go talk to them if you don't believe me? Don't just take my word for it, he says, but you can have verification for yourself. And Paul says, go talk to them if you don't believe me. So here are the disciples. They're pretty much going to their death for their belief that Jesus Christ is Lord. And they're so confident in the truth of the resurrection that Paul invites scrutiny. He invites people to prove them wrong. See, well, that's no big deal, Chris, because we've seen through history that a lot of people will die for false things that they believe. People will oftentimes die for things that they believe are and that they hope are true, like David Koresh and the Jonestown thing back many years ago. There's all kinds of false leaders, false teachers, and people go to their deaths believing things that are wrong. And this is true, unfortunately. But here's the difference. Is that people sometimes will die for what they hope is true or what they believe to be true. But nobody is going to die for what they know to be false. And the disciples and the early followers in the first church, they were in a position and they were in a moment in time where they would have known if it were false. And there's no reason why they would willingly go to their death spreading the gospel, defying the government authorities for what they knew was not true. They would never do it. There have been many theories of what actually happened over the years. Instead of just saying, okay, Jesus was resurrected, a lot of people have said a lot of theories of how the resurrection actually occurred or what really happened or the post-resurrection appearances. I don't have time to go through all of them. Here I'd recommend the great book, which is really easy to read, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It's a great book that goes through a lot of stuff. But one of the things that I've always been kind of amused at is that one of the main theories that was going around as far as Jesus' resurrection appearances were, well, it's just a hallucination. So it was a hallucination. People so wanted it to be true that they all just had this hallucination. And that is absolutely ridiculous. But yet that has been one of the main arguments for many, many years. Now listen, to my knowledge, I've never had a hallucination. I've never hallucinated that I know. But there's one thing that I know about hallucinations is that there's no such thing as a group of people having the same one at the same time. That just doesn't happen. Several years ago, I got permission to tell you this story, but several years ago, my dad, he had a bad cold, and I don't know what else, but he was really sick, and so he took some cold medicine. And so during this, he's in bed asleep, and my mom is in her sewing room down the hallway, and she's sewing. All of a sudden, she hears my dad talking to people. And she goes into the bedroom, and he's looking in the corner of his room, and he's talking to somebody. And she says, Don, who are you talking to? He's like, well, those guys over there in the corner playing cards. There's 4 of them. She's like, Don, there's nobody there. He's like, yeah, sure there is. Can't you see him? And the funny thing about it was he wasn't like alarmed by it. It was just kind of, some guys in my room hanging out playing cards. And she said, Don, there's nobody there. He's like, can't you see them? She says, no, you're messed up because of the medicine. You're having a hallucination. My mom didn't see the things that my dad was seeing. And for them to say that when Jesus appeared to all these people at different times, and sometimes small groups, sometimes large groups, and they all have the same testimony, there's no way that can be just this mass hallucination. Hallucinations, if you'll talk to any medical expert, they'll tell you that almost always they're caused by drugs or by bodily deprivation or being very, very ill. Hallucinations, again, are never seen by multiple individuals or groups over an extended period of time. Never seen by large groups, certainly at the same time. But listen, hallucinations have never led to a claim that a dead person has been resurrected. Hallucinations need a fertile, open mind. And I would also add that hallucinations aren't the basis for launching global movements and worldwide religions that last for 2,000 years. So Paul basically says Jesus appeared to all these people, different places, many of them together. They're still alive. You can check it out. You can talk to them. Now, why would he mention that? Why would he invite them to go investigate for themselves if he wasn't 100% sure of what he saw? Now, here's the deal. Back in that day, all that they would have had to have done to squash Christianity forever was just to come up with a corpse, just to produce a body. And we know from reading the Bible that the Romans, as well as the Jews to a degree, they would have loved to have done that. They would have stopped at nothing just to produce a corpse of Jesus so the people would stop this. And yet in the writing of that time in the first century, in the Bible and out of the Bible, there is never, ever any mention of a corpse. It's just kind of assumed that, yeah, the tomb was empty. Nobody has ever produced a corpse. The resurrection of Jesus Christ, the cornerstone of our faith, the cornerstone of our hope. In fact, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:17, if Christ has not been raised, then our faith is futile, and we're still in our sins. He says, if only for this life we have hoped in Christ, then we are to be pitied among all men. But the resurrection did happen. It is a historically verifiable event. He has been raised, and it was witnessed by so many people in different times and different places. And so our faith is not futile. Our hope is not in vain. Jesus Christ exited that grave, and so he is who he said he was. Now, again, there are a lot of other reasons why we can believe in the resurrection. So many reasons that to not believe in the resurrection, I think, takes more faith than to believe in it. And again, I'd love to give you every single evidence, every single proof, but there's not time enough to do that. Again, there are many, many books. I've preached other sermons that get a little more in-depth into it. But I do want to show you what I consider 2 or 3 of the most convincing proofs of the resurrection. And the first one comes from a guy named Josephus. Now, Josephus lived in the 1st century. He was not a Christian. He was a Jew. But he was a Jew who was kind of in the pocket of the Roman government. But he was also a very careful historian, and much of what we know apart from the Bible of that period in time comes from Josephus. Now, again, he wasn't a Jew, so he wasn't a Christian, so he wasn't being driven by trying to prove Jesus was who he said he was. And he would have every reason to discredit Christianity. But listen to what Josephus writes in AD 94 as definitive of the Jewish people, called the Antiquity of the Jews. He writes, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he really was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again on the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him." And then he says, "And the tribe of these Christians, so named for him, are not extinct yet to this day." This is what happened. Again, he's not a Christian. He would have every reason to discredit Christianity, but he was a historian. So he said, this is just what happened. See, I could go on and on about why I believe in the resurrection. And we can have a reasonable degree of certainty. There's enough reasons to believe. Another strong evidence that I think of oftentimes is the witness of the disciples and the early church. At the end of the book of Acts, again, the second book that Luke wrote, the end of the book of Acts, chapters 25 and 26, the Apostle Paul is on trial before a Jewish king named Agrippa and a Roman official named Festus. And Paul, by this time, he had been imprisoned, he'd been beaten, and he knew that he was going to lose his life very quickly. But he's telling them in this sort of court, he's telling Agrippa and Festus about Jesus and about all the things that Jesus did and who Jesus was. And at one point, Festus just has enough. And so I love what he says in Acts 26:24. Festus was like, "Hey, you're out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane. You're out of your mind. Like you just lost it. You're wacko. You don't know what you're talking about." And I love Paul's response. He's like, "I'm not insane, most excellent Festus. What I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely with him. I am convinced," said Paul, "that none of this has escaped his notice because it wasn't done in a corner." In that statement is one of the most profound claims of the Christian faith regarding the resurrection. That unlike every other religion that has come and gone, our central claims, our hope, our most important thing, the resurrection, was a public historical event. What wasn't done in a corner, says Paul, wasn't done in private, wasn't done in some secret place, but it was for everybody to see. Our faith isn't based on some guru who got enlightened, as was Buddhism. Our faith is not based on some lone prophet meeting by himself with some supposed angel, as in Mormonism. But our faith is grounded and rooted in history, in a time, and a place, and it was publicly verified by so many people. And so we can trust the most important event in the history of the world was, in fact, a historical event of first importance. An event, by the way, again, it was never questioned in the 1st century. Maybe you're not aware of this, but we have tons and tons of literature and writings from the ancient world in the 1st century. And it was never, ever questioned. The fact that there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth is never questioned. And the fact that he was resurrected in terms of this is what his believers believe, his followers believe, is never, ever questioned in all the other writings we have. But the other thing that I think is really convincing about the reality of the resurrection is that for 2,000 years, God has been changing lives by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, God's active presence dwelling among us and dwelling within his believers, has been going on for 2,000 years and has led to billions upon billions of transformed lives. People that would never have a passing thought of God and maybe were hostile to God. In fact, like Lee Strobel and so many others set out to disprove Christianity. And yet they have come to see when they investigate the evidence that it's true. See, the best evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, at least in our day and time, is the reality of transformed lives. That even though we can't see this resurrected Jesus, his presence in our life and in our world is unmistakable. Again, Lee Strobel wrote the great book, A Case for Christ. He's written many other books following that. And I don't believe everything that he writes. I would disagree with some of the things that he writes in some of his books, but not the Case for Christ book. Because he set out to disprove Christianity. Some of you know the story. They made a movie about it. I actually was going to show that movie this spring. Hopefully we'll be able to do that one day. But he was a legal affairs reporter for the Chicago Tribune, hard-edged man, looked into the worst grisly crime scenes and wrote about them. And so he was used to proof. One day his wife came home and informed him that she had become a Christian. And he was so upset by that he set about to disprove Christianity. And as happens so often, his scrutiny, his investigation led him to the reality and the unmistakable truth of Christianity. So he became a Christian and has gone on to be a pastor and to write books, and just an incredible story. But I heard a sermon of his a while ago. And he talks about how this truth of the resurrection, how it changed him. And he said this, he said, "How can I tell you the difference God has made in my life? My daughter Allison, who was 5 years old when I became a follower of Jesus, and all she had known those 5 years was a dad who was profane and angry. I remember I came home one night and I kicked a hole in the living room wall just out of anger with life. I am ashamed to think of the times that my little girl Allison hid in her room just to get away from me when I came home from work. 5 months after I gave my life to Christ, though, that little girl went to my wife and said, Mommy, I want God to do for me what he's done for Daddy." And at age 5, what was she saying? She'd never studied the archaeological evidence regarding the truth of the Bible. All she knew was that her dad used to be one way, hard to live with, angry, but more and more her dad is becoming another way. And if that is what God does to people, then sign her up. So at age 5, he says she gave her life to Jesus Christ. But he said, God changed my family. God changed my world. God changed my eternity. See, here's the deal, and I kind of touched on this last week. You know, the best proof, the most convincing evidence for the resurrection is the changed lives of those of us who claim to believe it. So I'd ask you this morning, how has your belief in the resurrection, in the truth of Christianity, how has that changed your life? How has your belief in the resurrected Christ changed you every day? Because here's the deal, and again, I said this last week. Today, I love this kind of stuff. I love proof and evidence and all this stuff, and it's good that we know these things. But here's the deal. Today, I'm convinced that people don't so much need convincing proof that the resurrection of Christ is real. What they really want is convincing proof that the followers of Christ are real. People don't want or need convincing proof that the resurrection of Christ is real. They want proof that the followers of Christ are real. That we really do live our lives according to the things that we believe. That we really believe this, and our belief is demonstrably demonstrated in our lives, and it affects how we live and how we think about things. And listen, we have a great opportunity during this period of life to maybe show a skeptical world that the truth of Christianity, the risen Christ, really does impact us, really does give us hope for the future, regardless of what happens around us. And we have a great opportunity to show that to people who might be wondering, is it real? Is it real? One of my favorite passages that kind of speaks to this in terms of how we as believers in Christ should conduct ourselves at all times, but especially at times like this, when so many people are afraid and hurting and there's so much death and devastation and anxiety and uncertainty. One of my favorite things is 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and how Paul tells us to conduct ourselves in times like this. And so 2 Corinthians 6, 3 through 10, but I'm going to read this out of one of my favorite translations of the Bible, written many, many years ago by a guy named J.B. Phillips. And listen to how J.B. Phillips translates 2 Corinthians 6, 3 through 10. He says, as far as we are concerned, we do not wish to stand in anybody's way, nor do we wish to bring discredit on the ministry that God has given us. But indeed, we want to prove ourselves genuine servants of God, whatever we have to go through. Patient endurance of troubles or even disasters, being flogged or imprisoned, being mobbed, having to work like slaves, having to go without food or sleep. All of this, we want to meet with sincerity, with insight and patience, by sheer kindness and the Holy Spirit, with genuine love, speaking the plain truth, but living by the power of God. Our sole defense, our only weapon, is a life of integrity. Whether we meet honor or dishonor, praise or blame, whether we're called imposters, we must be true, or called nobodies, we must be in the public eye, never far from death, yet here we are alive, always going through it, yet never going under. We know sorrow, yet our joy is inextinguishable. We have nothing to bless ourselves with, yet we bless many others with true riches. We are penniless, and yet in reality, we have everything worth having. This is what people want to know, that are we authentic? Are we sincere? The best evidence for the resurrection, the best evidence for the truth of Christianity are the followers of Jesus living and believing that it's true and that it's real.